morning, everybody, and welcome to Health Talk. I am your host, Dr. Niru Prasad, with my background in pediatrics emergency medicine, affiliated with Henry Ford Health System, St. Joe, Oakland, and Pontiac, and Beaumont, sorry. The theme of our health talk today is a very interesting new topic. What is the trip about mushrooms? Joining us today as our guest speaker is Dr. Allen Shreve, Mental Health and Trauma Services, and he is going to give his introduction, and then we will talk about this topic today. Good morning, Chris, and welcome to my show.
Good morning, good morning, good morning. Glad to be here once again.
I know, you know what, you have so much added to you, so I cannot even give your introduction in detail. So will you kindly share your accomplishment, author of the book and all that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm Dr. Allen Shreve, and I'm currently working in private practice, specializing in mental health and trauma services, and kind of keeping life simple, working out the house, doing virtual sessions, and but also very excited about new developments and new directions. And so today is going to be a topic that we're excited to present to our audience, and it's a topic about mushrooms.
Mushrooms,
right. What's the trip about mushrooms? So we're going to kind of run through, and I'm going to present this sort of like a reporter to you. I'm reporting to you on this topic of mushrooms.
Sure.
All right, so let's get started.
At the end of this, if we have time, then we will talk.
Absolutely.
But right now, I would like your expertise.
Yes, yes. Well, there is a lot of information to kind of go through. It's a very exciting topic, and let me just kind of give the backdrop. You know, this is a picture of various forests, and you can just see that our forests, our countrysides are all full of different types of mushrooms. And if you look at the species, these are all various different types of species of mushrooms. Some of them are for healing. They have a lot of healing properties. And some of them are also hallucinogenic, which also causes sort of a psychedelic trip that people take. But we're finding, and this is why we're talking about the topic today, that there's a lot of emerging research with the use of psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in hallucinogenic mushrooms in terms of trauma therapy. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So if we can have the next slide, we'll kind of keep moving here. So the three things we need to kind of see about mushrooms is there is this substrate that exists throughout the world below the ground. It's our root system, and it's all connected. If you watch a lot of documentaries, this mycelium is a root system that connects the entire world together. And this root system is what supports the forests, the countrysides, the landscapes in terms of the decaying process. So this mycelium has an intelligence. And this mycelium is the intelligence of our forests that produce oxidative oxygen and help with the metabolism process, the decaying process of when trees fall down, they kind of start to decay and then they return back to compost. This is sort of a product of the mycelium that exists. From the mycelium, you have different types of spores and fungi that are created in these forest environments. From those fungi, you also then will have spores that then sprout mushrooms. And so you have two different types of mushrooms, generally speaking. You have what they call adaptogenic mushrooms, and you have what they call psychedelic mushrooms. And there are thousands and thousands of variety of mushrooms. If we could have the next slide, I'll kind of show you a depiction of how this underground network kind of works. It's a vast array of millions and millions of miles of this root-like system that connects all plants together and connects all forests together. And so this is where you'll find the mushroom spores actually, giving birth in the forests. So we can have the next slide. We can also see some of the adaptogenic types of mushrooms. And I've just listed 5 of the top main adaptogenic mushrooms. And that's lion's mane, reishi, turkey tail, cordyceps, and chaga. And I want to talk a little bit specifically about what they do. So we can have the next slide. The health benefits of adaptogenic mushrooms are just vast, and I thought that you would love this presentation because, you know, you're the MD and I'm the psychologist side, so this is more on the health side. This is kind of in your backyard. So we know that adaptogenic mushrooms help to reduce the effects of stress. This is one of the main things that you'll find in the research with the benefits of some of these mushrooms I just identified, is that they have a major impact on stress levels. And that is due to the effects that they have on cortisol. And so it gets kind of complicated. I don't want to get too much into the science and chemistry of how this works, but it's involved in our hypothalamus pituitary adrenal system. And this system is where our stress responses are housed. So adaptogenic mushrooms have the ability to regulate this stress response and in fact reduce, based on MRI studies, the level of cortical blood flow that also reduces the stress hormones. So that's really the major adaptogenic benefit of these types of mushrooms. If we could have the next slide. So some of the main specific benefits, and they're just, you know, there's a ton of mushrooms I could have talked about, but these are the top 5 or 6. So lion's mane is a mushroom that looks kind of white and it grows like, looks like a lion's, you know, mane. And what you'll find health-wise, that it increases neurogenesis, which is connected to dementia. And so neurogenesis, as you well know, is the rebirth of new neurons, the rebirth of the new neural networks, firing of new nerves, which is related to dementia and cognition. So lion's mane helps to increase cognition and decrease the inflammation that affects dementia. You can also see that it can relieve depression, anxiety. There's some research that suggests that it can help with women who are experiencing menopause. It projects the digestive tract, helps with heart disease, manage diabetes, fights cancers, and everything related to the immune response. Reishi, again, another mushroom, immune boosting properties, detoxifying the body, helps with memory, lowering blood sugar, things of that sort. Yeah, did you have a question or anything?
Clinical, no, I was just wondering, the reishi, what you have mentioned, from my clinical point of view, this is the kind of mushroom that goes to the amygdala, below the hypothalamus, right?
Absolutely.
Because that's the area that controls our emotions.
Exactly. So that's what this emerging research is showing in this area. Mushrooms have been around since the planet was created. This mycelium was part of the development of the earth. And so mushroom spores have been around for millions of years. So you'll find that ancient man and many cultures used mushrooms routinely for healing and health purposes. So we have turkey tail, cordyceps, shiitake. They all pretty much have the same types of benefits. Turkey tail is high in antioxidants, phenols and flavonols, which is also important with immune. You've got the polysaccharides that help with cancer and gut health. Some of these are antiviral, antibacterial. So some of these you can actually use in food. Many of these probably don't taste very well. And so when they prepare these concoctions, they sometimes dry them, make them into powders, and then put them in different concoctions. And we'll talk about that in a minute. If I could have the next slide. So again, the concoctions. And you can go online and you could just Google right now, mushroom products for wellness, and it will bring up a variety of different companies. And as a little shameless plug, I've started a company as well with 2 business partners, and we're going to be producing our own combination of using mushrooms on the non-hallucinogenic side to create some of these health products as well. We're going to add some different kinds of things as well to kind of be unique. But you'll find like the lion's mane, the chaga, turkey tail, cordyceps, you'll find all these different products widely available online. And there's a lot of research that's beginning to emerge behind that. The next slide. So I want to kind of flip it to the other side of the mushroom story. And that's kind of where our title comes from. What's the trip about mushrooms? And I think, as I began to start to study this field, my interest was from a trauma perspective.
Right.
I do a lot of work with trauma.
Yeah.
I put out a book last year that was about trauma. Yeah. And I started to see the emerging research related to using psychedelic mushrooms, magic mushrooms, to treat people with PTSD, depression, and anxiety. And it started to get really exciting when Johns Hopkins University was given approval from the FDA to begin to do their trial studies using psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. So if we could have the next slide. Psilocybin, is, like I said, the active ingredient, and it's really converted very quickly in the body to psilocybin. And this is where we get the mind-altering effects. And it's very similar to what people experience when they take LSD and mescaline and DMT. And LSD has a history of going back to the 30s and 40s, and it was widely studied by the military. And then it kind of became a Schedule I drug, but then it became popular in the hippie culture in the 60s and 70s, primarily around Timothy Leary, who was a big proponent of using LSD. And so that created a whole movement in the 70s.
Right. So, Chris, just for 1 minute, I have seen a lot of those kind of cases, at the emergency room.
Yes.
How the people, they come euphoria.
Having a bad trip.
Trip.
Right.
And the bottom line came like psilocybin.
Yes.
So
yes.
I'm very much aware of this particular.
Yes. Now, the research is emerging, and it's pretty clear today that psilocybin, believe it or not, is actually a safe drug, and it is not habit forming. And I think when you look at the propaganda that's been put out for the last 50, 60 years on mushrooms and all of the hallucinogenic category, it's very condemning, and it speaks like it's very harmful. And of course, there are harmful things that happen. LSD, mescaline, all these different hallucinogens, people can have an adverse reaction and have a bad trip, and you can't predict what a bad trip's going to look like. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as we kind of get on, because you're finding that these types of mushrooms are now being used in therapy, and that's kind of where I kind of got involved in. So in general, the effects are euphoric, and you have mental and visual distortions,
hallucinations,
and some changes in perceptions, and distortion of time, and you might hear colors and see sound. It's just a lot of different things are happening in the mind. Some of the adverse reactions can be nausea and triggering panic attacks. So you have to be careful, depending on the person's background, whether or not they should use hallucinogenic mushrooms. If we could have the next slide. So what do they look like? There's thousands of varieties, and as I understand in this hallucinogenic mushroom business, they're creating more different blends of mushroom strands by cross-pollinating these spores. So this is a picture that probably represents 5 or 6 different types of hallucinogenic mushroom products, and you can see they're dried, and people can eat them, or they can put them in tea, or they can be powderized and put into capsules and swallowed. Yeah. So if we can have the next slide. So again, what is one experience? We kind of talked a bit about that. It takes about 30 minutes for the onset of these mushrooms to kick in, and you, like I said, you can be taken in tea or soup or a variety of different ways. And a trip can last, 4 to 6 hours, or for the majority of the day. And during that time, like I said, you may experience a lot of different types of things. But generally, the research is suggesting that there's been no fatalities or any real health issues related to the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms. Now, other compounds that are synthetic, that might be different. They may, mimic the chemical compound of psilocybin, but because of them being synthetic, they could be much more potent, which could cause the adverse reactions. If we could get the next slide. So again, why are we talking about this subject? Because when I sent it to you, it's kind of like, what do you mean? So why? Because my interest is I'm a therapist, and I talk to people, and I've found that many people are struggling with PTSDs or lesser forms or greater forms of PTSD, and dealing with their traumas and their life stories. And so a lot of times some folks can be so traumatized or have experienced such horrible things, like many of our soldiers. I work with police officers, firefighters. Everybody has a story, and a lot of these stories can activate those trauma circuits and put a person in a state of fight or flight, which is kind of what I talked about in the book. So what we're finding in the research is that And Johns Hopkins was the first major university that was given approval by the FDA and the DEA because this is still a Schedule I drug, which means there is no research value and it serves no medicinal purpose. So that includes all the categories of hallucinogens, PCP, methamphetamine, and other drugs of that sort. And marijuana also is in that category.
Of course. I was going to ask you about marijuana.
Right, and you can see kind of as we're getting more educated about the medicinal effects of cannabis and now hallucinogens, you can see that the Schedule I category really is not appropriate or applies because the research is really showing medical and clinical efficacy for the use of both cannabis and mushrooms. So this study came from a university that was looking at giving folks, it's a 3-phase study, and they gave them 25 milligrams of synthetic psilocybin, and they found through tracking these folks over time that their depression and PTSD symptoms went down over time. So that's really a major breakthrough in the field of depression and anxiety and PTSD, because the reality is the pharmaceutical industry doesn't have any real more drugs that they can create to help with depression, anxiety, and PTSD. So we need new alternatives, and this area is being widely investigated as a possible breakthrough in the treatment of PTSD, depression, and anxiety. So if we can have the next slide. So they work by reducing cerebral blood flow, specifically going into the area of the amygdala, which will impact serotonin regulation. And when you start to manipulate serotonin and dopamine, you can decrease the stress response and you can decrease the depression. That's what they do with, antidepressive medications that helps to regulate the serotonin uptake. And so a lot of those are SSRIs, serotonin-specific reuptake inhibitors. Can't say that 5 times. So that's kind of how the mushrooms are working, pretty much in the same mechanism that antidepressants are working.
Like the other drugs.
Yes, and what we're finding, here's the beauty, is that there's less side effects.
Yeah, so just one question. This is added to the regular regime of treatment.
Well, let's talk about that. Well, this is a whole new breakthrough, and this is where I'm really...
Cannot by itself.
Yes, well, I don't think we know enough yet because it's a Schedule I substance. You cannot use this on record in therapy. Now, there are companies and agencies that are training therapists to become psychedelic assisted therapists, but that handcuffs the therapist because we're not able to give patients mushrooms, and we're not technically supposed to do the therapy involving a Schedule I drug. So there's still a lot of hoops to jump through, but Oregon just recently got approval to begin training therapists to do therapy with patients who have taken a trip and then help them process their trip. And so that's kind of what's emerging in the clinical field, is the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms with patients to process depression and trauma. The first thing that got started was ketamine. And you've probably heard of ketamine because they use that in hospitals.
I heard a lot and saw that.
I had a patient just tell me yesterday that when she was hospitalized, she was in so much pain that they couldn't give her any more pain medication, and the doctor tried something different, and they gave her ketamine, and the ketamine created sort of a dysphoric euphoria, aura, and she went into sort of like a trance-like hallucinogenic state. She wasn't hallucinating, but she was able to disconnect the pain from what she was going through. And that's how these mushrooms work. In the brain, they're able to disconnect the emotional pain from the story. Now that's really powerful.
Yeah, it's very powerful.
Because people stop therapy because they don't want to deal with the emotions and the pain that's created by going through and reliving these events.
Exactly.
And that's the nature of PTSD, is the flashbacks, the reoccurring thoughts about what happened in the past. And so mushrooms, with the aid of a therapist processing that trip they had, can help them re-regulate the emotions that come along with those stories that are traumatic. And so that's a whole new avenue in therapy. Now, your question was, will they use that in conjunction with regular psychotropic medications like, you know,
or reduce
Prozac?
the dose, reduce the dose when you are has FDA approved?
Yes. Well, I think this is what these trial studies are starting to look at. Johns Hopkins, if you go on their website right now,
I went to
there
the
are
Johns
a
Hopkins.
ton of trial studies that they're conducting. And so those are some of the questions that we will begin to answer as time goes on. The combination of psilocybin with antidepressants, anti-anxieties, and so forth. I would say, to be on the safe side, you probably would not want to mix any other medications with the psilocybin, because I think the value of the therapeutic value of psilocybin is in the ability to create this mind-altering experience so that you can then process through your trauma. I don't think anyone knows how a psychotropic like Prozac or Zoloft or the variety of different types of meds that we have could impact or interfere with that process. But that would be a great research study to conduct, and that's kind of where we're at right now in the infancy of this field and industry. And you know, the pharmaceutical industry, as you can imagine, is double stepping to kind of patent psilocybin and start to begin to use, you know, this with therapy, in therapy. And it's exciting. It's going to be a huge thing. It's going to be a really huge thing.
It's going to be a huge, big, another platform.
Yes, yes, yes. I'm currently getting certified and getting trained to be a psychedelic, there's different terms for it, but a psychedelic psychotherapist, or, you know, assisting someone through processing through their trip. So ideally the model right now, because of the law, is that patients find their own mushrooms and they do their own trip at home, and then they come in to an office and then talk with the therapist and process what they experience. And so that's very beneficial. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, and I'm excited too. I wanted to ask you, what is the role in the children's? Is there the role in the pediatrics population,
you know,
yes or no?
I think that would be...
because as a pediatrician, I have seen a lot of mushrooms, but that is poisoning, mushroom poisoning in children.
Well, you know, again, these are all great questions, and the field is really in the infancy of that kind of question, but there is this thing that they call microdosing mushrooms. So let's talk a bit about that. So microdosing mushrooms, and let me just talk about this slide before we talk about that. This slide is actually like a room set up to do the therapy. So assuming that this patient, they could be currently going through their hallucination trip right now. So the therapist is there to help them process any of those emotions and to really help them not have a bad trip. So you really want to have a very tranquil environment, a very peaceful, relaxing atmosphere. You don't want to take a trip on a bad day. You want to be in a good space and that kind of thing. And for therapy purposes, you want to be guided through that whole process and certainly be able to have access to therapy to talk about what you experienced after that process. Right. So that's kind of how the rooms are set up, and you can see they're very comfortable, you know, almost like a hotel room, and very soothing and quiet and peaceful, so that person can really experience the trip. Oftentimes they will be given blindfolds so they can block out any visual stimulation, and they might be listening to music or blocking out any sound stimulation, because everything gets enhanced while you're in that trip. Okay. All right. So we were talking a little bit about your question before in terms of pediatrics and that involvement. I think because of the nature of any drug, you have to absolutely be careful with adolescents. Now, I talked a little bit about microdosing. Now, microdosing, so like, for example, this person who's taking this type of trip, we don't know what dose level, how many grams, but ideally to get an experience, depending on the potency of the mushroom and the experience the patient has with taking mushrooms, it could be anywhere between 1 gram and 3.5 grams in terms of a dosage. So for getting smaller therapeutic benefits that don't create quite a hallucinogenic trip that might last 4 to 6 hours, they have this thing called microdosing. Microdosing is taking much smaller amounts of the mushroom to get sort of a reaction and effect, but not the full trip. Now, what they're finding is that when people take, let's say, 0.3 grams of a mushroom, you might take that over the course of a week. You might take it every other day for like a week. And what they're finding—
The minimum dose.
Yeah, minimum dose.
Yeah,
and what they're finding is that folks in studies are having much longer reductions in their depression symptoms over time when they microdose mushrooms. So you don't actually have to do the whole trip.
Right.
You can actually take much smaller dosage that could then be used more therapeutically and probably a much, I don't want to use the word safer because the drugs are generally safe, but obviously you can take too much and have a really bad trip. And so, but there are guidelines for how much that you would take based upon what you're trying to do. And this is all new territory.
Right.
And nobody really has hard guidelines on how much you administer. But like that study was 25 milligrams. That's roughly a quarter of a gram.
So that is for the adult. But
Yeah.
for the pediatrics, there are more like micro.
Well, you know, again, this would
Maybe
have to be—
adolescent and adult.
It would probably be
FDA
something
will
that
not
would
approve it,
happen later in the
pediatrics,
curve of learning about
yeah.
mushrooms and how they're being used with adults therapeutically. I will predict, however, that probably with adolescents, depending on the diagnosis and the severity, because I'm seeing research on autism,
Yeah, right.
ADHD,
Yeah,
and
autism,
mushrooms.
yeah.
So, and that's all with microdosing. And so giving smaller amounts to patients who are autistic. I have a mother, I spoke with her yesterday. Her son's 23, and he's having a lot of behavioral problems. They're fighting. They're kind of getting into fights because he's becoming very aggressive. There's research that is suggesting that microdosing mushrooms with some autistic patients is helping to reduce that type of behavior. So again, it's very new, it's very, you know, cutting edge, and some would say controversial, but I would argue could be breakthrough. Could be some breakthroughs found there.
That is true.
So maybe adolescents at some point.
Adolescent.
Probably more like teenagers. I don't know if we would want to necessarily give our
Because
kids
the
this
teenagers
drug.
have a tendency to go high on the marijuana and all those.
Well, with the developing brain, you really have to be careful. And I know from growing up with my friends and you know, some of those guys taking LSD and mushrooms, and that sometimes you can trip and not come back.
Right.
And so I think that's more related to the adolescent brain developing.
Right.
Is there any other slides? Let's see if we had anything left here. That might be our last slide for the presentation. So I just kind of wanted to say that, you know, this is a very
new field.
new field. It's exciting, it's emerging, very controversial. Because again, what we're doing is looking at drugs that were given such bad labels and made to be such horrible things. A lot of that was, I think, propaganda. I think a lot of it was not based on research.
Right.
And so now we're putting the research to it, and we're finding that drugs like ketamine and MDMA and hallucinogenic mushrooms may have a lot of therapeutic value.
Yeah, I think, you know, I agree with you because I have done a lot of reading about this ketamine and marijuana. But this adding mushroom to the regime, especially, you know, with the autism spectrum,
could be very exciting.
That would be very helpful.
And there's studies on nicotine suppression and all kind of stuff. So I know we've probably gone a little bit long here, so I just kind of wanted to report to you on this subject.
This is very good, and I'm going to add it from my pediatrics perspective. I have seen a lot of these, you know, individuals involved with the PCP, marijuana. For the mushroom, to tell you the truth, I haven't seen any using mushroom as a hallucinogen. But then we will all, both of us will look together, and I will report it to you.
Absolutely. We'll keep talking about it.
Sure. So thank you so much for coming to my show. I'd like to thank our viewers for joining me today on the Health Talk with Dr. Chris Shreve, and we are talking about the role of mushroom. what is the trip about mushrooms. Until I see you all again, have a safe and a wonderful winter. Thank you again.